In February 2017, Parks Canada opened a shipping container in the Panther Valley of Banff National Park and released 16 plains bison onto ground that had not felt a wild bison hoof in more than 140 years. By 2024, those 16 animals had become more than 130. But what was happening underneath the hooves was the part nobody fully predicted. The herd had spread across 1,200 square kilometers of backcountry, adapted to high-elevation mountain terrain, and begun reshaping the valley in ways that classical mountain ecology textbooks had never described. The Reintroduction was officially a pilot. 7 years in, it was producing ecological effects that researchers are still working to fully characterize. And some of what the bison are doing to the land, even the project managers admit, does not match what the model said should happen in the Canadian Rockies. This is the complete story, from the mass slaughter that erased these animals from the continent to the 7-year scientific gamble to bring them back, to what GPS collar data and field surveys are now revealing about what 16 bison can do to a mountain valley in under a decade. Most videos about bison reintroduction show you the release footage and the baby calves and call it a success. This one follows the data 7 years deep, into the soft-release pasture, the first wild calvings, the herd's refusal to behave like the models predicted, and the scientific evidence of what grazing, wallowing, and trampling are doing to the ecosystem that had been running without them since before Canada was a country. Every claim in this video is sourced from Parks Canada's official project reports, the 2023 final report on the Plains Bison Reintroduction pilot, and a peer-reviewed scientific paper published in Frontiers in Conservation Science by the project's own manager. This is not speculation. This is what 7 years of monitoring actually recorded. But before you can understand what the bison are doing now, you need to understand what North America lost when they disappeared, and why the return of 16 animals to a single valley in the Canadian Rockies matters far more than the number suggests. The plains bison is not just a large animal, it is an ecosystem engineer. An adult bull weighs up to 900 kilograms, nearly a ton of muscle, bone, and horn moving across a landscape. A cow weighs around 500 kilograms. They live in herds that can number in the hundreds, and historically in the millions. They graze on grasses and sedges, but the way they graze is the key. They move constantly, they graze in patches, they leave some areas heavily cropped and others untouched, creating a mosaic of grassland structures that no single species grazer can replicate. They wallow, rolling in dirt to shed parasites and winter coats, and every wallow leaves behind a bare soil depression that becomes habitat for insects, amphibians, and pioneer plants that cannot colonize dense grass. They trample. They redistribute nutrients through their dung and urine across enormous ranges. And when they move in herds, they create trail networks that become movement corridors for dozens of other species. Scientists have a specific term for what bison do. They call them a keystone species and ecosystem engineers whose grazing, wallowing, trampling, herding, and migratory behaviors drive energy flow and nutrient cycling at the landscape scale. That is a technical description of an animal that, when present, reshapes everything around it. Later in this video, you will see what that reshaping looks like when it returns to a valley that has been running without it for 140 years. Some of what Parks Canada documented in the field surveys is not yet fully understood. But first, how North America lost these animals in the first place. When you remove an animal like the bison for 140 years, you do not just lose a species, you lose a set of processes. The loss was not accidental. Between 1860 and 1885, a window of just 25 years, tens of millions of plains bison were killed across the Great Plains, the foothills, and the front ranges of the Rocky Mountains. A population that had numbered somewhere between 30 and 60 million animals was reduced to fewer than 1,000 survivors. It was one of the fastest large mammal extinctions in recorded history, and it was not driven by hunger. It was driven by policy. The peer-reviewed Banff case study states it directly. The slaughter was carried out largely with the colonial intent to destabilize and remove the independence of indigenous groups who relied on bison, so their historic homelands could be more easily settled. The consequences rippled outward. Grasslands that had evolved with bison grazing for tens of thousands of years began changing structure without them. Wallow-dependent species lost their habitat. Indigenous peoples whose entire material and spiritual cultures were built around the bison suffered catastrophic disruption. In the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies, in what would become Banff National Park, the bison simply vanished, gone from a landscape that had carried them since the last ice age. Then, almost accidentally, Canada helped save them. Around 1907, the Canadian government purchased several hundred descendants of the last wild bison from 2 Montana ranches and shipped them to Elk Island National Park in Alberta. That small founder population, now considered one of the purest genotypes of wild plains, bison remaining anywhere in the world, became the source for bison reintroductions across Canada, the United States, and even Russia over the next 100 years. What Banff did next would take more than 2 decades of planning, cost millions of dollars, involve multiple First Nations, and depend on 16 animals surviving a release into mountain terrain none of them had ever seen. And it almost didn't happen. Serious discussions of reintroduction of wild plains bison to Banff began in the late 1990s, when a small fenced tourist herd inside the park was shut down to restore a wildlife corridor. Feasibility studies identified suitable habitat for up to 1,000 wild plains bison inside the park, with a low risk of disease transmission to the nearest cattle, which graze 20 to 50 kilometers away. A formal reintroduction plan was published in 2015. It emphasized both ecological and indigenous cultural benefits. The program was built on precise science and careful logistics. In February 2017, 16 plains bison, 10 pregnant cows, and 6 young bulls, all disease-free, were captured at Elk Island National Park, loaded into shipping containers, and transported more than 400 kilometers west into the Panther Valley on the eastern slopes of Banff. This is rugged, high-altitude Rocky Mountain terrain, with steep slopes, long winters, and snowpack lasting into June. These animals, bred from Great Plains genetics, had to prove they could adapt to mountains. They were released into a 1.2 square kilometers soft-release pasture, a fenced enclosure designed to let the herd bond, carve, and imprint on the landscape before being turned fully loose. That soft release lasted 18 months. The bison stayed together, they carved, they learned the valley. In summer 2018, the fence was opened and the herd walked into a 1,200 square kilometers free-roaming zone in the backcountry of Canada's oldest national park. The question was not whether the bison would survive. It was whether they would spread, whether they would behave like mountain animals, and whether the rest of the ecosystem, wolves, grizzlies, elk, and bighorn sheep, would accept them. What happened next exceeded every projection Parks Canada had written down. The bison adapted to the mountains faster than the models predicted. GPS collars fitted to 5 to 10% of the herd showed animals moving to high-elevation summer forage, exactly the kind of altitudinal migration that historic Rocky Mountain bison populations would have performed, even though no living bison in this herd had ever done it. The behavior returned on its own, encoded somewhere in the animals themselves. The herd mostly stayed within 30 kilometers of the release site, established core home ranges, and began producing calves every spring. By the end of the 2017 to 2022 pilot, the population had grown from 16 to approximately 80 animals. The average annual growth rate was 33%, at the high end of what is biologically possible for plains bison. Natural mortality was less than 1% per year. These are numbers that describe a population not just surviving, but thriving in an ecosystem the program was not certain would support them. Over the next 2 years, the herd continued to grow. By 2024, Parks Canada confirmed that more than 130 plains bison were now roaming the Banff backcountry, more than 8 times the original release size in just 7 years. But the biggest surprise was not the numbers. It was what the bison started doing to the landscape itself. Karsten Hoyer, the Parks Canada project manager, who has led the reintroduction since its beginning, and who co-authored the peer-reviewed case study on the project, summarized the outcome directly. He said the reintroduced herd has grown from 16 to over 100 animals, and the eco-cultural approach has increased the resilience of the rewilding project. He also said something quieter that captures the philosophical center of the entire effort. Bison need to be wildlife, like other species. They want to move across our human-made boundaries. How we meet their request as a society will determine the long-term success of this project. And that is where the ecological story gets genuinely interesting. Because what Parks Canada's monitoring teams documented in the field was not just a growing herd. It was a landscape beginning to change underneath the animals. The first surprise was behavioral. The bison were using the terrain in ways that were not in any model. They were climbing to high-elevation summer forage, the subalpine meadows above treeline, and grazing there seasonally, then descending to lower valleys for winter. This is a behavior pattern documented historically for Rocky Mountain bison, but one that had disappeared for 140 years along with the animals that performed it. The herd rediscovered it in under a decade without any human teaching. The second surprise was ecological. Parks Canada's monitoring showed no negative effects on elk, bighorn sheep, wolves, or vegetation at current bison densities. That is significant because one of the primary objections to bison reintroduction in mountain landscapes is the concern that bison will outcompete native ungulates or overgraze sensitive vegetation. 7 years of data showed the opposite. Long-term studies on grazing effects on vegetation structure, soils, and bird communities are ongoing, but early qualitative rangeland assessments showed healthy forage use with no signs of overgrazing across the 1,200 square kilometers of home range. What the bison were producing instead was heterogeneity. Patches of heavily grazed ground next to ungrazed areas. Wallows, the rolling depressions bison create that become microhabitats for specialized plants and invertebrates, were scattered across meadows where there had been no wallows for 14 decades. Trail networks wove through willow and aspen stands. Bare soil patches that pioneer species could colonize began to appear. The bison were not replacing other grazers. They were adding a pattern of disturbance that only bison produce, and the grassland mosaic that depends on that pattern was beginning to return, and that was only the ecological surprise. What the bison did culturally was something else entirely. The Banff reintroduction was not designed as a pure ecological project, it was designed as an eco-cultural one. A peer-reviewed case study, published in Frontiers in Conservation Science in 2023, documents how indigenous ceremonies, cultural knowledge, and monitoring were woven into every phase of the reintroduction, from the Elk Island capture, through the Panther Valley release, to the ongoing management. The Stoney Nakoda Nations, Siksika Nation, Piikani Nation, Kainai Nation, Tsuut'ina Nation, Katunaksa, Shuswap, Samson Cree, and the Rocky View Métis District all contributed to a project that explicitly recognized that plains bison are not just an ecological keystone. They are a cultural keystone, the foundation of food, clothing, lodging, and spiritual life for indigenous plains cultures across North America. The authors of the case study concluded that this eco-cultural approach, weaving indigenous knowledge with Western scientific monitoring, has increased the resilience of the rewilding project. The reintroduction did not just bring back an animal, it began healing a relationship that had been severed alongside the herds in the 1880s. Parks Canada is now exploring regulated indigenous harvest of bison as part of long-term herd management, a step that, if realized, would make the Banff reintroduction the first major conservation project in North America to explicitly integrate indigenous hunting back into modern wildlife management. The Banff herd is currently the 5th free-roaming, unfenced plains bison population in the world. All of the others, most concentrated in the Yellowstone area, represent fewer than 8,000 animals across less than 1% of the species' historic range. Out of more than 500,000 plains bison now alive in North America, only 4% are managed for conservation. The rest are in the ranching industry, where selective breeding for weight and fecundity is steadily altering the bison genome away from its wild form. Against that backdrop, what Banff has done with 16 animals in 7 years is not just successful, it is strategically significant. This herd is one of the few places on Earth where plains bison exist as wildlife, not livestock, not tourist attraction, but wild animals making their own decisions about where to graze, when to migrate, and how to shape the landscape around them. 16 bison, 7 years. A home range of 1,200 square kilometers in the Canadian Rockies. A herd that has grown by more than 800%, adapted to mountain terrain its ancestors never had to navigate, and begun reshaping a valley in ways scientists are still measuring. And a partnership between Parks Canada and the First Nations of the Rocky Mountains that has turned an ecological reintroduction into something larger, a restoration of both a species and a relationship. But Banff is not the only place where a returned species is reshaping a landscape in ways scientists did not predict. In our next video, we go to a coast on the other side of the Atlantic, where 245 eagles were released onto a shoreline that had not seen them in over a century. What the satellite data revealed about their behavior is still being studied. If you thought 16 bison could change a valley, wait until you see what 245 apex predators did to an entire country. You will not look at ecosystem recovery the same way again.